Hey everyone, welcome back to another Tic Tac Taiko. You know, a lot of Taiko instruction is geared towards generating more power. How to make power, how to be more efficient with power, how to have it on naname versus otaiko versus katsugi okedo, etc. So this week, I'm going to list all the different ways a Taiko player can generate power. So I'm introducing the Power Primer. When I talk about power in regards to Taiko, I don't mean just hitting harder, because that's strength. And that kind of hitting leads to, well, overhitting, which leads to distorting the sound and damaging the equipment. When I talk about power, I mean force generation, hitting just hard enough to get the sound you want. I'm also not going to cover any of these methods in great detail, hence the fact that it's a primer. If there's interest, I can do a deep dive on all or any of these in the future. And before I get into my list, I want you to come up with a list of your own. You don't have to write it down. It's not a quiz. You can make a mental list, but think about all the different body parts and the concepts and ideas a Taiko player might use to generate power. You can pause the video if you need to. At the end of my list, we can compare notes, but if you need to pause it, now's the time, because we're going to start in 3, 2, 1. The first power generator on my list is also the one I think is the most important, and that's gravity. The cool thing about gravity is that it does not care what your stance is like. It doesn't even care if it's a good or bad stance, whatever that means. It doesn't care how you hold your bachi. As long as you can raise your bachi higher than the surface you're going to hit, you can use gravity. So from here, if I just let my bachi or let my arm fall, wasn't a clean hit, wasn't efficient, but it generated a decent amount of power. And as a tall person, I have the advantage of getting up really high, so high that you can't even see how high I am. And when I let it fall, it generates a lot of power. You'll also find gravity helps even with something like odaiko, which you wouldn't think about going down, but let me kneel so you can see. If I'm pulling my arm back, and the drum I'm going to hit is here, that's still going down. It's not a lot of down, but any down will let you use gravity. When it comes to naname and gravity, my arm just wants to drop down, but I want to hit over here. So I will have to use other parts of my body, which we'll talk about in a minute, to help guide the bachi over, but it's still dropping. It's still utilizing gravity. Just not as direct as it was in naname. Next up is the workhorse of power generation, the legs. If I take a more neutral position with my weight more centered and I extend the rear leg, it's pushing me to the other side, where I have a drum in this case. I'm springboarding, I'm uncoiling, I'm pushing off, however you want to phrase it, with a very large muscle group, if you will. That's got the potential to generate a lot of force in one direction. And it doesn't matter if it's naname or horizontal yoko uchi style drum, all of that force is going to the side. If I go back to my neutral position and extend both legs, I'm going to go up. This isn't very useful if I'm striking to the side, but if I'm facing the drum head on and I'm trying to do a diagonal or vertical strike, then this motion can add power. It's especially potent if I'm doing a diagonal strike, and not only am I going to the side, but also upward at the same time. There's a lot of force that can come out of this type of generation. In terms of beta or shime or anything where the drum is below or lower, the legs can't really add power. And this might be controversial. Good, I would love to have this discussion. The legs can push side to side, the legs can push up, and of course, any combination of those two, which gives you a nice 180-degree range of motion. But the drum is low, it's below, and the legs can't push down. Even if I'm really high, I can't push, I can only drop. The legs can be shock absorption, the legs can do lots of things, but it cannot add power going down. Related to the legs, but separate, are the feet. It's really hard to push off without using both, but I can still separate them. At least I can justify separating them. If I have my neutral position and I push off with the foot, trying to keep this knee bent, I can still move a decent amount. There's a fine line between where the knee starts to activate, but I can still feel like there's something going on. In fact, if I lift my heels up, I can generate a lot without really activating the legs. So that's a pretty good indication that there's power available. And even if I turn my foot inward, like if I'm playing naname, my weight is forward, I can push off a lot by lifting the heel, activating the ankle, and my leg is part of the process, but it's still not activating like it would, like I did in the previous example. Another way to look at it is if my foot is mostly forward and I pivot so much that I'm pushing the heel all the way around in an arc, that's a lot of potential motion. I'm pushing myself off a lot, and the leg is reacting to that motion. And finally, when you have a drum on either side and you're moving around or in between, like your Yodan Uchi setup, you have motions that turn and you're pushing off the feet to get to the other side. The feet are helping, just like the legs, push up to get you that upward diagonal strike or vertical strike if you want, but it's also storing that energy, all of that momentum that you generated, and then it's pushing off. It's reacting to the weight that you put onto it. It's a definite power generator right there. And it should come as no surprise. If the legs can't generate power downwards, then neither can the feet. Again, the feet are useful, the legs are useful, but in terms of power generation, which is what this video is all about, they can't help. Let me tell you a really good power generator that most people don't think about, and that's hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, because they generate a ton of power. Trust me, try it, find out. Anyways, moving on. Moving up the body, we get to the hips, and the hips are all about rotation. 3 different kinds of rotation. The first rotation is a forward and backwards tilt, involving the torso leaning forward and back. Not so much on naname, but on Taiko, you definitely see this motion. This feels very comfortable in playing Taiko, especially when you've got the arms pulling back. It's a very natural power generator. The next rotation is side to side, and this is not very common in Taiko. You will sometimes see naname playing where the posture is similar to the angle of the drum, but that's different from moving side to side. This doesn't really add a lot to power. Yeah, it's got some motion on it, but it's a weird arcing type of feel. However, on occasion you do see it. I know I've done it when I'm exaggerating a solo, when I'm swinging the arm up, and then I'm leaning back into the strike. So it is useful, but it's not necessarily something you always want. The third and final and most popular kind of rotation you'll find with the hips is parallel to the ground. And in conjunction with using the legs and gravity, you can get this corkscrew effect. And there's so much power to be had here, especially on naname. Rather than just turning this way, which does have a lot of power potential. I'm not using anything but the swing of my hips. But once I drop, once I push, once I use my arms, there's more than enough power going into the drum. In terms of hip rotation with beta or shime, again, the forward and back, it's somewhat useful, but once you cross a certain point, then you're starting to actually hamper your own technique. The side to side, again, not really useful, even less useful, unless, of course, you're doing something that's exaggerating the technique. And the parallel rotation, it feels unnatural to not rotate at all. So there's almost a natural rotation, but that's not necessarily generating power. It could be, but I don't think it's adding a lot of power. And I actually do see a lot of Taiko players who over-rotate, whether it's just comfortable or whether they think it's actually generating power. And I feel like it's taking away from the power because you have to compensate with every subsequent strike. And this is very similar with Taiko. If I have a drum in front of me, we talked about this obviously not so good, but I also see a lot of over-rotation as well, which has the same issues that it does in beta. You have to overcompensate for the next strike, which takes away from the potential power. The next power generator is the most obvious one. I'm sure anyone who made a list included this, and that's the arms. The arms for me include a lot of different things. They include the upper shoulders, the triceps, the biceps, the forearms. There's a whole host of things in this group. Because they're sort of the most obvious, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I am going to mention one unique property that the arms possess. The arm can choose to stay relatively straight and generate a lot of power in a linear fashion, but the arm can also bend, turn, and do so in mid-strike while still maintaining and even generating power. Something like this has a lot of different things going on, but all of it is adding to the strike. Next up on the list is my favorite power generator, the wrists. I have taught entire workshops just on wrist snap at several different Taiko conferences. That's how important I think they are. The wrists give you a 360-degree field of motion. You can strike up, down, outside, or inside. And if I isolate my wrist, let's hold the arm close to my body, hold the arm nice and tight, and I'm going to grip in a very uncomfortable position so my fingers can't contribute. I can still get even just 2 fingers. I can get a pretty good snap and a pretty fast snap, relatively speaking. So that's a potential amazing amount of power in such a small space. No matter what kind of taiko you play, naname, beta, odaiko, katsugi okero, if you're not using the wrist to help you, then they're probably hindering you. In fact, my philosophy is it doesn't matter how many power generators you're using, doesn't matter how hard that strike is, if the wrists aren't supple and loose and contributing to that whip at the end, then they're probably tight or locked and they're actually taking away from the power you've worked so hard to generate. One other thing about the wrists. Up until now, all of the power generators really shine when the bachi is far away. You're using gravity, you're pulling with the muscles of the arm, you're pushing your weight into the drum. But the wrists really help facilitate rapid playing, small notes, or even playing quietly when using a body isn't really helpful here. And next are the fingers. Now, a lot of taiko players tend to think of the fingers as more nuanced tools. The thing that happens at the end that makes the small adjustments to a strike. But the fingers have an incredible potential for power. When I was a kid, I remember hearing the Zen riddle, what's the sound of one hand clapping? And I thought, well, that's an easy answer. Humor aside, you can see and hear the potential for power in the snap of the fingers into the palm. And if I isolate everything, including the wrist, and just squeeze the same way with a bachi in my hand, I get a lot of power, surprising amount of power. And the last category on my list is momentum. Momentum for me is a catch-all, if you will. It encompasses many different things, but they all share a common characteristic. Momentum includes the bachi, because mass times acceleration equals force. So I can do all kinds of things with my body and gravity and whatnot, but when I add the bachi, it's another way to generate force. Here is the thing that's actually hitting, and the weight and acceleration of it play a factor. Momentum can also be the sum of multiple power generators. So for instance, if I push off the foot, extend the leg, turn the hips, whip the arm, snap the wrist, and squeeze the fingers, all of that contributes to momentum. Momentum is also follow through. If I have a normal linear strike, I drop, I turn, whatever, the bachi might come up in a bounce, but this is it. It stops. I might pull it back, I might hit again. Follow through continues after the strike, and all of this motion may not be useful, it may be wasted, but let's say I do another arm circle. Then all of this motion is added to the power going into the next one. And finally, momentum is also rebound, recoil, bounce, however you want to call it. The bounce back after the hit. The bachi will come off the drum, and for the most part, it's not very useful, especially for beta. What's going back up when my drum is down. On naname, it's also not that useful unless you have a drum on the other side. You're able to then use that bounce. So imagine I have a drum here or down here, bounce, bounce. don don, or do 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 do. I definitely use that bounce, even if it's maybe more of a mental idea. It's that feeling that I'm going into the other drum because of the help of the impact on the first drum. And there you have my list for the 8 different power generators a taiko player can have. Now let's talk about your list. Did you have more or less or the same number that I did? Did you think I should have grouped a couple of them together or maybe separated some of them apart? And did you come up with power generators that I didn't? For any of those, all of those, I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments section below. That's what it's for. And until next time, keep on generating power and be well.